I'd like to go ahead and get started. My name is Helena Solo Gabriel. I am the president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. I'm going to say a few words in Spanish and then come back to English. And I will say a few intermittent phrases in Spanish as I go throughout. We have three speakers. They will be two in English and one in Spanish. All three speakers can accept questions in both languages. So I'm going to switch to Spanish. Bienvenidos a la conferencia de la Asociación para el Estudio de la Economía Cubana. Agradecemos la participación de todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Tenemos profesionales de Cuba. Sé que es difícil venir de Cuba y agradecemos todo el trabajo que han hecho para compartir con nosotros aquí en Miami. Welcome. As mentioned, I'm very thankful to all the participants. I thank the board members who have contributed to this conference. This conference is put together purely on a volunteer basis and is very challenging when it's volunteer. But it's come together, and I'm so thankful for all the help that we've received from our board of directors. We also have various members of the committees who have contributed as well, and we have members at large who have also contributed their time. So it's a huge team effort, and I'm very thankful for all of that help. And I'd like to also thank all of the participants and those who have come from far away to visit with us and share your work with us. A little bit about ASCI. ASCI is a nonprofit, non-political organization founded in 1990. The mission is to study the elements and processes of a transition to a market economy in Cuba and to promote consonant scholarship research publications by its members. We are a non-political organization. We accept all points of view and enjoy the discussions and different feedback that we receive on Cuban economic issues. Also like to emphasize that we have a website that has all of our works on it. It's www.ascicuba.org, and I recommend that everyone come and visit the website. One of the major contributions of ASCI that I'd like to emphasize is an incredible compendium of works from over 27 years. There are publications that are free of charge, available on the website, over 1,100 papers on the website. Quería enfatizar que aquí tienes muchos trabajos publicados en el web por gratis que se pueden ver, y es un trabajo formidable de la organización con más de 1,000 papers que están publicados ahí. También quería agradecer el patrocinador del programa, Christopher Reynolds Foundation. We'd like to thank our program sponsor, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation. They provided funding to support scholars from Cuba and also for the student competition. For the program, we have the traditional sessions focused on Cuba economics issues, focused on tourism. We also have some additional sessions as well on specialized areas such as a water economy session and so forth. We have sessions Thursday, Friday, today, tomorrow, and half of Saturday. Today, I wanted to emphasize that lunch is available in the hotel at the Brisa restaurant. It's a cash lunch. There's a buffet available for $20 per person. And it's a quick way to get lunch so that we can get back on the program again. Tonight, Thursday evening, we have a reception, and everyone's welcome to attend. We will have some appetizers at the reception. Hoy hay un almuerzo en el restaurante La Brisa. El costo es $20 por persona. Es una manera de comer rápido para entonces volver a la conferencia. Es un buffet. Y también hay una recepción esta noche que todos están invitados con tapas. Mañana, tomorrow, we have a lunch, a $45 lunch that has to be prepaid, and then we have a board meeting in the afternoon. Mañana hay un almuerzo que cuesta $45 que hay que pagar por adelantado, y tenemos una reunión de la junta directiva por la noche. I also wanted to emphasize that this year we have a few different aspects to it, some experimental sessions. We have the student paper competition Friday afternoon with representation from around the world. I'm very excited about the results of the student paper competition. I also want to emphasize for the first time that we have a virtual student session. So you can log in, it's free of charge. The login information is on the program. You can tell your friends and family if they want to listen to a session, and it's an experimental session that we are trying out to see how to work through the webinar type concept and integrating it into a conference. Also this year we have 2 law sessions for continuing education credits. Este año tenemos una sesión virtual por computadora que se puede entrar por computadora y el link está, el enlace está en el programa. También quería enfatizar que tenemos libros afuera por Books and Books. Por favor, miren los libros, si te interesan, se pueden comprar. I wanted to emphasize that outside we have Books and Books, and I encourage you to take a look at the books that are available there. Also wanted to mention that we have already planned for next year. We are going to host our next year's meeting, ASCII 2018, July 25th through 28th, almost exactly 1 year from now. We are in the process of finalizing the venue. It's most likely we'll be here, but we have not yet signed the contract. But we definitely have the date of July 25th through the 28th. El año que viene, el ASCII va a ser casi un año exactamente, entre el 25 al 28 de julio, para el año que viene, para que ya puedan planificar para la próxima. So at this point, I'd like to start the plenary session. We have 3 speakers, as mentioned, Carmela Mesa-Lago, Omar Everleni, and Jorge Perez Lopez. Carmela will be speaking in English, Omar in Spanish, and Jorge Perez Lopez in English, I believe. So Carmelo y Jorge van a hablar en inglés, Omar en español, pero todos pueden recibir las preguntas de los 2 idiomas. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Carmelo Mesa-Lago. Carmelo is a distinguished service professor emeritus of economics and Latin American studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He's the author of over 94 books and 318 journal articles, half of them on Cuba. His most recent book, in Voces de Cambio en el Sector No Estatal Cubano, 2016, he was president of LASA and has received the ILO International Prize on Decent Work, shared with Nelson Mandela, ASCE Annual Distinction Award, the LASA Prize on Excellence on Cuban Research, and he has been selected among the 50 most influential Ibero-American intellectuals. At this point, I'd like to ask Carmelo, if you can come up.
So my presentation is going to be on social conditions in Cuba. And there are 2 factors here which are important. The first one is population aging, and the second one are the structural reforms undertaken by Raúl Castro since 2007. And you can see which are the topics that I are going to discuss. All the data comes from the Institute of Statistics of Cuba, ONEI. We have data for 2016, but not for all variables. and I have done some calculation as well. So the first issue is population aging in Cuba. At this point, Cuba has the oldest population in Latin America. It was supposed to pass Uruguay in 2015 and 25. It have already done so. And you can see here in the green curve, this is the percentage of population which is 60 and above. And as you can see, it have increased from 67% in 53 to almost 20%. And it is predicted that for the year 2030 will be 30%. So this variable is going to affect practically everything, as we will see. And the problem that you have is that the birth rate in Cuba, which is in the blue curve, have declined from 2.5 per 1,000 to 1.04. And then the population growth goes from 2.1 to 0.02. So it's basically stagnant, eventually will be declining. There have been years in which it have declined already. An important thing is that the so-called productive segment of the population, which is from 15 to 60, is declining already, as we are going to see. So here you have the economically active population, labor force, and employed labor force for the entire period from 2010 to 2016. The blue curve is the labor force. And as you can see, there has been a decline, more accelerated since the year 2014. And the red curve is the employed labor force, which is more important, and is declining also actually between 2011 and 2016. There have been a decline of 8.5%. Of course, you have a main factor here is the aging of the population, as I mentioned before. Now, I talk about visible or open unemployment, but also hidden unemployment, which is underemployment different ways. In Cuba, this is mostly created by an excess or surplus labor in the state sector. So you have the blue is the open or visible unemployment, and as you can see, it was quite high in 1998. And then this is the point in which it was the lowest in the Cuban history under socialism. It was only 1.6%. In 2010, Raúl Castro announced that there was a surplus of the labor force in the state sector. First, he mentioned 500,000, then 1 million, and finally 1.8 million, which is about 36% of the labor force, that have to be dismissed. And they began to do so. You can see that the open unemployment, the blue, increases until it reached 30.5% compared with more than twice what it was in 2008. But then the process of dismissal of the surplus stops. And the reason is that they were hoping to have the people moving into the private sector or non-state sector. I have grown significantly, but not enough to absorb the labor surplus. And so they stop it. And once they stop it, then your unemployment, visible unemployment is declining, and it's not there, but for the year 2016 it's 2%. So it's, again, while this is happening, the surplus labor is increasing again. And this is what I call the hidden unemployment. You can see that the peak was in 2010 before the dismissals began. And there have been some reduction, but still in 2015, 26% of the labor force was a surplus. Combining the two, you have 28% of the labor force either open or hidden unemployment. And with the process of with the process of restructuring, and here this is essentially an effect of a structural reform, wages have declined very significantly. During the crisis of the 1990s, as you can see, it went down to 10%. 100 is an index number, is a base. That means that the reduction was 90%. Purchasing power declined 90% in the crucial year of 1993. And there has been a slow recovery, which is accelerated mostly under Raúl the last 4 years. And as you can see, it's now 39% of the base, which is 100. So that means that purchasing power in 2016 is 61% below 1989. This is also an effect of the structural reform. You have an increasing inequality in Cuba. What I have done here is to use the median wage as the base, so that's 1.0 is a coefficient. You have the absolute figures in the columns in both CUP when available and CUC. And then if you look at the above 1.0, minimum assistance benefit is 0.2, minimum wage 0.3, and the minimum pension 0.4. So all these people are way below the minimum wage in the state sector. And then, however, average remittances in 2016 was 1.4, meaning that those who are getting remittances are much better than those getting the state median wage. But if you go to the self-employed and tourist sector, that's 5.8. And even further, a luxury parlor in Cuba is making 284 the median state wage. So that's about 2,000 times the median state wage. And the least mentioned to tourists, 424, that means 7,000 times the median average wage. Cuba, as early as 2007, had the biggest social expenditure of all of Latin America, both compared with the state budget and GDP. And you see that the peak is the blue curve, which is social expenses as a percentage of the state budget. In the social expenses, we include education, healthcare, social assistance, housing, etc. And the peak was 55.4% of the state budget, and the peak a little 1 year later was 36.6%. That's extremely high. This I have written years ago, more than 20 years ago, that this was financially unsustainable. And finally, the government, Raúl, admitted this, and then they began the process to cut social expenditures. As you can see, by 2015, we don't have the data yet for 16, it declined 40.3%. In relation with GDP, declined from almost 37% to 28%. Both, there is a decline of 8 percentage points in this period. And now let me go into Social Security pension. Here you have two factors, both aging and the structural reform. Aging because there are a higher percentage of people in the age of retirement, and the structural reform because all the changes that have been introduced, particularly 2008. The green curve is the Social Security deficit as a percentage of the total. The problem in Cuba is that the contribution made by employers, we were until recently mostly state employers, was only 10%. And the workers were not contributing. And the ages of retirement were 55 for women and 60 for men. And so this wasn't sustainable. And in 2008, there was a reform by Raúl Castro, in which he increased the age of retirement in 5 years, so it's now 60 and 65, and increased also the employer contribution to 12%. As a result, and that was done gradually in a period of 4 years. So you can see that although this was introduced in 2008 when the deficit was 40.5, the deficit continued to increase because the ages were not introduced immediately. It peaked in 2013 with 43.8%. Then the effects of the reform began to take place, and as you can see, the deficit is declining. It goes down to 23.3. So this is very successful under an economic point of view, but of course you increase the ages by 5 years, and even though Cuba have the longest, the highest life expectancy together with Costa Rica and Latin America, and ages of 60 and 65 still are very low by regional standards, and particularly in terms of longevity. Therefore, of course, the 12% is insufficient. The workers are starting to contribute, but only a very small percentage does so. So what you have is that eventually, I predict that in 4 or 5 years, this decline is going to get to the lowest point, and then it's going to increase again. And of course, there is an actuarial deficit for many, many years. Just so you have an idea, in 2010, instead of 12%, in order to maintain an equilibrium and eliminate the deficit, it should have been the double. In other words, it should have been 22%. And therefore, this is unsustainable, and we are going to see a reversal in that trend. Okay, another way to reduce expenses is to simply freeze the medium pension. Now, this is adjusted to inflation, so it's a real pension. And under the special period, the crisis of the 1990s, it goes down from 100% is the base for the index numbers. So you get 16.1% in the middle of the crisis in 93, which is a decline of 84% of the medium pension. Then this started to grow very slowly and it stabilizes around 50%. This figure of 51% in 2018 is preliminary. I have to make some calculation because I don't have all the data. But let's say that it has been stagnant for several years at 50%. That means that the pension is 1/2 in real terms of what it was in 1989 before the crisis. The median pension is 270 CUP. That's a moneda nacional, which is equivalent to $11 per month. So nobody can. The minimum wage is not enough to buy food needs, much less is the medium pension because we are talking about 1/3 of the median salary. Therefore, one of the most vulnerable groups is that of pensioners. Okay, health care. Because you had a cut in the social expenditures, as you saw, a very significant reduction, you have a decline in all the facilities in Cuba. So the number, we are talking about the period between 2007 and 2016 here. So the number of hospitals declined 32%. Rural hospitals were closed in 2011. Now all patients are sent to regional hospitals. Total health personnel decreased 22%, except for doctors, physicians that rose 21%, and many of them are abroad. All the personnel fell. The most important decline is family doctors, a very important program that began in Cuba in 1986, and it provided primary care. And that have shrunk by 40%. The rest are abroad. And there is a severe scarcity of medications. In conclusion, both access and quality of healthcare has diminished. On the other hand, infant mortality continued declining. Of course, there are discussions about this. There is a famous demographer here, Sergio Díaz-Briquet, that have written a lot about that. And it declined from 5.3 to 4.2. It's the second lowest in Latin America, that's after Canada. In 15-16, you have an increase of 1 decimal point, so it's 4.3 per 1,000. On the other hand, maternity mortality rose from 31 to 42 per 100,000 women. That's 11 percentage points in this period. Here are the declines in different personnel. I am not going to talk about education. I don't have time for that, but there is a session in the afternoon, the session of convivencia, in which the whole panel is dedicated to education, so I will invite you, if you can, to attend that. And now let's go into housing. Okay, so in the blue bars are in thousand, so that the number of dwellings that were constructed per year. So you can see that in the year 2006, the year that Raul took over because of Fidel sickness, it was 111,400, and that declined to 22,100. That is a decline of 80% in this period. Remember that all these are statistics from Cuba. I am not using anything but Cuban statistics. This is official data. And then if you measure that in terms of units per 1,000 inhabitants, which is the red bar, it goes down from 9.9 to 1.9. So it's a decline of 8 percentage points. The deficit in housing was announced in July during the National Assembly, and is now 883,000. The deficit before was given at 600,000, then 700,000. 5 years ago, I estimated that it was more than 1 million. At this point, I have to do a calculation, which is not an easy one, but I will do it, and I am sure it will be much more than 1 million. And finally, in Cuba, we have increasing poverty. The latest data that we have is for a survey of 2000. That was 20% poverty incidence in the city of Havana, worse in the countryside. There are no statistics after that, but we have several factors that make us certain that poverty have increased. The first one is insufficient salaries to cover food needs. We saw that already. The second one is the extraction of products from the regional lease and selling at market prices. The deterioration of health services. In view of this situation in which poverty have increased, one would expect that the social safety net, social assistance, will expand. But what we have here is just the opposite. So the red curve is the beneficiaries of social assistance in relation to the total population. It goes down from 5.3 to 1.6. The blue line is beneficiaries' expenses, social assistance expenses in relation to GDP, and it goes from 2.2 to 0.4. So in conclusion, Cuba has the oldest population in Latin America. This has some adverse effects that, combined with structural reforms, have very profound adverse effects in social conditions. The labor force has been declining, accelerated in 2015 and 2016. Unemployment plus underemployment is 28% of the labor force. The minimum state wage is 61% of the level, below the level of 1989. Social expenditure have shrunk 8 percentage points of the budget and GDP. The pension financial deficit have been cut in the short term, but it will eventually, in 4 or 5 years, increase again. The pension is half of the 1989 level, and those cover, of course, food needs. All healthcare personnel, save for doctors and facilities, have been cut. Education enrollment shrunk 72%. Dwellings built fell 80%, and now the deficit is 883,000. Poverty and income inequality have risen notably. Social assistance, instead of expanding, has contracted drastically. Economic reforms have not had yet tangible effects on the economy, just the opposite, but have worsened living standards among workers, pensioners, and the population. Conditions will aggravate unless the reforms are deepened, accelerated, and a social safety net is established. And it's 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
That was perfect timing. We have time for 5 minutes of questions, and may have some time at the end for additional questions. At this point, are there any specific questions for Carmelo? Go ahead.
Yes, more of a comment. Carmelo. Those who looked at Allende's Chile and Nicaragua and the decline of the Sandinistas, the data you show are accurate. Statistics around the government. However, when a dysfunctional economy like that occurs, there's robbery, there's thievery, there's transfers, there's all kinds of things. I wonder if you have any idea of the caveats you would make with some of your data. People don't live at 10% of what they used to live. Usually they steal something, they rob something. Is there any underestimation in your data?
No, I don't think there is any underestimation. Well, the situation may be worse. We don't know. I mean, I am presenting you with official figures. There is no way that we can check this. However, your point is well taken. Nobody can live in Cuba with a minimum wage, which is $30, and a pension, which is $10. Either you receive remittances or you simply survive. So, resolver, which means you steal from the state. And this is a way, or you are in the private sector. And you have a paladar, or you have a leasing, or you are driving an unmanned drone for tourists, and then you make a lot of money, as I show you in the table.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Michael?
Yes, it was a fascinating set of information you gave, and there was something that intrigued me, and that is what, if any, correlation might there be between the declining situation for healthcare and the fact that the population is now the oldest in Latin America. On the surface, it would seem the less you go to the doctor, the longer you live. I'm sure it's not that. But I'm just curious what you make of these different things that might seem anomalous.
Well, if you have a growing old segment, meaning more than 60 in the case of Cuba, obviously you are going to have people living longer and having illnesses which are much more expensive than the ones that the younger tail of the population has. That means that your expenses are going to increase significantly. Another problem is that Cuba still is spending a lot of money to keep a low mortality, infant mortality rate. Although there are some questions about that figure, and that is completely absurd because already they have a very low infant mortality, and they will have to shift money as much as they can for the older population because they will have also terminal illnesses that are extremely expensive. But what we have seen is that there are cuts in practically everything. So you are going to have a crisis situation in the middle term, much more in the longer term. How are you going to finance healthcare for the older segment of the population, which is growing exponentially?
Okay, we're going to move on to the, thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next presentation, which will be given by Omar Everleni. He received his doctorate of economic sciences from the University of Havana in 1998. He's a titled professor and former director of the Center of Studies of the Cuban Economy. He has served as a visiting professor at universities in the United States, Japan, and France, and he's taught more than 300 lectures in Cuban centers and abroad. He has published more than 75 journal articles and magazines and has been a co-author and editor of several books published in Cuba and in other countries. Omar?
Bueno, como dice el título, la economía cubana, ¿dónde está y qué debería hacerse? ¿Qué debería hacerse? Porque aún no se hace lo que hay que hacer. Y los economistas todavía no hacemos lo que hay que hacer en Cuba. Voy a rescatar en mi intervención dos ideas de Carmelo Mesalao que yo creo que son importantes. No solo basta tener recursos monetarios, los cuales no tenemos, sino con qué vamos a tener esos recursos monetarios en el futuro si no tenemos personas para lograrlo. Es decir, tenemos ya una situación que es difícil salir de ahí. Es decir, cada vez la población se envejece y cada vez las personas, o sea, nacen menos personas. Y eso es un problema de recursos laborables que vamos a tener. Es decir, del año próximo en lo adelante, la población no solo envejecerá, sino que va a estar disminuyendo. Lo cual significa que 250.000 de trabajadores en estos momentos están trabajando después de la edad de jubilación y muchos de ellos se reincorporan después que se jubilan. Lo cual es un problema que no es fácil de resolver bajo las condiciones actuales. Ahora, ¿cuál es la situación actual? Bueno, es un país que crece poco, crece a un promedio de los últimos 8 años de un 2%, con un decrecimiento del año pasado, una recesión económica. Parece ser que se salió de ahí y se sale con un 1% de crecimiento, lo cual casi se anula cuando tú decreces el año anterior. Y se espera que este año 2017 esté alrededor del 1%. Muchos se cuestionan, bueno, ¿cómo se llegó al 1%? Bueno, es la etapa donde el turismo creció a una elevada tasa y es el año donde la zafra azucarera creció un 20%. O sea, son dos indicadores importantes que permitieron llegar al 1%. Pero bueno, el 1% no significa nada. La economía cubana necesita crecer al menos al 5, al 6% consecutivamente durante un periodo largo, si realmente queremos avanzar hacia el desarrollo. Vemos cómo es un país que las exportaciones cayeron en el 2016 en un 27%. Si no exportas no tienes divisas, a pesar de toda la situación que tiene. Y las importaciones también cayeron. Es un país que invierte poco. Si sigues invirtiendo alrededor de un 10% de tu Producto Interno Bruto, ¿qué vas a lograr en el futuro? El factor que hace crecer una economía siempre a futuro es la inversión. Y el país se consume todo lo poco que logra. Es un país que tiene un déficit fiscal creciente y este año va a ser el récord en el déficit fiscal. Se espera que alrededor de un 12% de déficit con respecto al PIB, lo cual hace inmanejable todos los programas que quieras hacer. ¿Cómo vas a hacer? Bueno, después lo adelantamos, la parte monetaria. Voy a ir muy rápido en la parte del comercio exterior de bienes, porque después Jorge Pérez López se va a encargar de eso. Pero sin embargo es un país que mantiene un alto déficit comercial de bienes. Seguimos importando cada vez más y cuando se recortan las importaciones, se recortan también las exportaciones. La concentración del comercio sigue siendo Venezuela, a pesar de que ya no es la Venezuela del año 2015. En el año 2016 cayó el comercio con Venezuela en más de 1.500 millones. Por lo tanto, ya podrán imaginarse qué está pasando en este año 2017. El comercio de bienes y servicios acorta su brecha. No obstante, es un país que pagó en solo un semestre 2.306 millones de deuda externa. O sea, ¿cómo se podría pagar 2.306 millones en solo 6 meses? Nada más se explica por un recorte drástico del nivel de importaciones. Pero si tú recortas las importaciones, ¿cómo quedará la industria en el segundo semestre? Ya sabrán. Sin embargo, el único factor que parece ser que no tiene un resultado, o sea, que tiene un resultado importante, aleccionador, y va a seguir por los próximos años, es el turismo. O sea, el número de visitantes a Cuba crece. En el primer semestre se logró 2.600.000 turistas y hace 2 días se logró 3 millones de turistas. O sea, un 25 de julio que se llega a 3 millones de turistas, yo creo que es importante pensar para el futuro. Y los estadounidenses siguen visitando Cuba. Estas son las estadísticas de enero a junio. Lo pueden ver. Ya en junio de este año llegaron a Cuba estadounidenses 348.000. Ahí no están los cubanoamericanos. O sea, con 348.000 visitantes al cierre de 2017 en junio, se espera que por lo menos se alcance 450.000 si sigue ese ritmo. Julio se mantuvo ya los primeros 15 días, según supe, también creciendo ese ritmo. Y con la medida de la OFA diciendo que para qué asustarse si todavía no están las reglamentaciones, por lo tanto, da idea. Sin embargo, sí conozco que muchas cancelaciones de Airbnb se han producido en el mes de agosto por temor a que salgan unas reglamentaciones y muchos de los que estaban involucrados puedan cometer alguna violación. No obstante, sigue llegando el número de visitantes. No todos van por Airbnb. O sea, hay un grupo importante de personas que siguen yendo por grupo y entonces ahí habría que ver si... Pero es un crecimiento importante que sigue arrastrando el crecimiento de la... Yo traigo un caso particular para que vean que el turismo no solo está beneficiando al país entero, sino a determinadas comunidades, determinados. No le traje el caso de Viñales, le voy a solamente traer el caso de Trinidad, cómo realmente en esa pequeña comunidad ha recibido casi 300.000 personas en 4 calles que tiene Trinidad. Y eso significa un importante crecimiento, no solo para las familias involucradas, sino para el Estado del municipio. Es decir, los impuestos que recibe el municipio de Trinidad del sector privado pasaron a ser ya el 57%. Por lo tanto, el Estado en Viñales, en Trinidad, está interesado que sigan llegando turistas a esa comunidad y está interesado en que se sigan rentando viviendas. Porque el ingreso al presupuesto, estos es los ingresos al presupuesto del municipio, lo que viene del sector estatal y lo que viene del sector privado. Cómo realmente ya el sector no estatal paga más que el Estado en ese municipio. Y eso es válido para Baracoa, es válido para Viñales, es válido para determinadas comunidades, lo cual hay un peso importante. El número de trabajadores por cuenta propia sigue incrementándose, no a los ritmos de crecimiento del pasado, pero sí. Sin embargo, se prevén nuevas regulaciones en los próximos meses. Cuba es el único país del mundo que persigue la riqueza en vez de perseguir la pobreza. Entonces, no, si persigues la riqueza, no vas a nunca tener un crecimiento en PIB, ni nunca vas a tener los recursos financieros que necesitas. ¿Cuáles son los aspectos que yo quiero destacar? Primero, que las licencias están muy concentradas en 4 o 5 actividades, y eso es una dificultad porque la fuerza de trabajo en Cuba es altamente calificada. Sin embargo, se trabaja en actividades de poca calificación, pero muchos ingresos. ¿Qué está llevando eso? Una descalificación de la fuerza de trabajo. No me importa que me digas que eres ingeniero. ¿Dónde trabajas? En una paladar. Entonces no eres ingeniero. Entonces, eso está pasando. Que hay en las estadísticas mucho nivel cultural, sin embargo, en los oficios no están relacionados con esa preparación que tienen. Para las personas es mayores ingresos. Siguen habiendo dificultades con los insumos, con los pagos de impuestos, con los créditos, y el Estado intenta regular a los pocos ganadores que hay. O sea, no hay ganadores suficientes y ya el Estado le empieza a preocupar. Y ahí te explica que realmente los cuentapropistas han sido financiados con créditos bancarios solo el 6%. ¿Y de dónde ha salido el resto de las actividades? O sea, ¿de dónde sale el financiamiento para los ganadores? Bueno, de varios lados, de aquí y de allá. Las cooperativas es un tema postergado, han aprobado 4 grupos y realmente esos 4 grupos dicen en la pasada asamblea que están todavía en fase experimental. Yo no creo que 4 años sea tanto tiempo para un experimento. Yo creo que con 1 año es suficiente. Siguen habiendo dificultades con los insumos. Ahora dicen que hay que regularla. Llegó un momento en que las cooperativas de la construcción tenían más empleados que los obreros de la construcción estatal y eso les preocupa. En vez de pensarlo al revés, ¿qué pasa en mis empresas que la gente se me van para las cooperativas? Entonces, la unificación de las monedas. Ese es el largo camino. ¿Cómo se puede unificar moneda? Si no creces, si tienes déficit fiscal, si estás endeudado, no le pagas a los proveedores. Con esa situación macroeconómica, ¿usted cree que es posible introducir el tema de la unificación de las monedas? No sea sin prestamista de últimas instancias. Raúl dijo, no, este proceso no esperará por las calendas griegas. Pero bueno, ¿cuáles son las calendas para ti? Si lo que le quedan son 6 meses. Entonces, es un proceso complejo, lento, y por lo menos los que vivimos en Cuba sabemos que va a ser muy difícil que en lo que quede de año se pueda lograr una unificación monetaria, una incertidumbre más en la población con todos esos temas. Pero bueno, en Cuba muchas cosas son imprevistas. No voy a introducir ahora el tema de las implicaciones, pero todo el mundo sabe que mientras que exista esa dualidad de tasas de cambio, esa tasa de cambio de 1 a 1, que lo que hace es penar a los exportadores, es muy difícil, y sobre todo la discrecionalidad que hay en la toma de decisiones. Hay múltiples tasas de cambio. Si trabaja en el turismo es una, si trabaja en la zona de desarrollo especial es otra, si trabaja en la industria azucarera es otra. ¿Cómo se puede manejar una economía con múltiples tasas de cambio? ¿Quién es productivo? ¿Quién no lo es? ¿Cuál es la rentabilidad de la economía nacional? Traigo la zona especial de Mariel porque parecía ser que era la joya de la corona, la que iba a resolver los grandes problemas de Cuba. No sé quién manda en Cuba, porque Raúl Castro dijo que realmente iba muy lento el proceso, que había que tomar medidas. Pasaron 6 meses y el mundo se quedó igual. 24 compañías aprobadas en 2013, solo 8 en operación, y en operación es construyendo la nave donde van a operar. No hay ninguna sacando productos todavía. Entonces, ¿para cuándo es la zona especial de Mariel? ¿Y a qué velocidad? Se sigue pensando en nuevas carteras de oportunidades. Ya van a ser la 4ª cartera de oportunidades. Como si tener en un libro una oportunidad ya es suficiente para que vengan los inversionistas. Con un entorno macroeconómico, con tantos problemas que tiene, con deuda, etcétera. Aunque es un buen proyecto. Yo creo que sí es un buen proyecto, es una buena idea, pero algo pasa que no se avanza suficiente, ni en el Mariel ni fuera de Mariel. Fuera de Mariel lo que avanza mucho son los contratos de administración hotelera, los campos de golf, etc. Ahora, ¿qué debería hacerse para cambiar un poco esa situación? Yo creo que son disímiles las acciones que se pueden hacer. La primera es que si no incrementas las exportaciones, no vas a obtener recursos financieros necesarios. Pero si no descentraliza la actividad exportadora, solo 7 empresas son las únicas que exportan en Cuba. ¿Cómo puedes tú aumentar tus exportaciones con esa centralización en las decisiones? Yo creo que la pequeña y mediana empresa, a pesar de que aparecen en los lineamientos, aparece en la conceptualización, no veo en el corto plazo indicios de que se vayan a aprobar. Por lo tanto, mucho menos se van a crear instituciones financieras no bancarias para ayudarla. Yo creo que Cuba, ahí está Rafael Romeo, que lo puede decir, tiene que entrar en un organismo financiero internacional, necesariamente. Con la CAF se han logrado tener ciertas relaciones, pero la cosa avanza muy poco. Y hay que apoyar a las cooperativas urbanas. Otras cosas más. Bueno, si tienes una ley de inversión extranjera, si tienes una zona especial de Mariel, ¿por qué te demoras en las aprobaciones de empresas que no son norteamericanas? Hay más de 400 proyectos de empresas que han llegado a Cuba. ¿Por qué no se aprueban? Si no tienes capital. Bueno, si sigues trabajando en las empresas estatales, donde el gerente no es gerente, sino es administrador, ¿cómo vas a avanzar en las decisiones? Hay que descentralizar la actividad estatal, sobre todo la empresa estatal, y cambiar las reglas de juego. Todas las instituciones siguen funcionando con el mismo esquema de anterior, muy conservador, con mucha rigidez, no toman riesgos, siempre esperan señales desde arriba, imposible bajo ese entorno, si no lo cambian. Creo que hay que aumentar las actividades que se trabajan de forma privada. Yo creo que la lista de las 201 actividades está paralizada desde el 2011, estamos en el 2017. ¿Dónde están los recursos humanos altamente calificados en los negocios privados? Una consultoría, otro tipo de empresa. Bueno, el tema del internet, ¿para qué lo voy a decir? Los campesinos están trabajando por diferentes formas. Se creó la empresa de acopio y ustedes pueden ver los casos de los mangos. Y en la asamblea un directivo dijo que por qué le iban a comprar mango a ese campesino, porque ese campesino se comprometió a 40 toneladas y le trajo al mercado 60. Que no, que el compromiso de él era buscarle las 40, las otras otro problema, en un país donde no hay mango. Fíjense a lo absurdo y como lo explica un directivo ante la televisión, de que ellos han entregado más productos de lo conveniado. Un reconocido economista cubano, Pedro Monreal, ha dicho recientemente, ya estoy terminando, a la gente no le interesa que se declare en abstracto que la nación será próspera, sino que le interesan dos cosas. En primer lugar, cuándo y a qué ritmo se avanzaría hacia la prosperidad nacional, o sea, cuándo me toca. Y en segundo lugar, cuándo esa prosperidad le va a tocar. Lo primero puede medirse con el índice de desarrollo humano. Lo segundo se mide como un indicador de distribución del ingreso, como pudiera ser el índice de Gini. O se adoptan metas ambiciosas que sean medibles y por los cuales deban responder los funcionarios, o se corre el riesgo de diseñar un esquema ambiguo de desarrollo, quizás cargado con una narrativa florida, pero poco relevante. O sea, muchos documentos, mucho voy a avanzar hasta 2030, pero ¿dónde están los pasos que voy a seguir y dónde me voy a beneficiar hasta el 2030 si es que llego? Por lo tanto, si nos vamos a convertir en un país desarrollado, tenemos que tener un índice de desarrollo humano de 0.8. ¿Y cómo llegar al 0.8 con las tasas de crecimiento que tenemos? Si seguimos la tasa de crecimiento en 2,5, ojalá que se tenga al menos eso, hasta el 2034. Hay una persona que le diga, no te preocupes que en el 2034 usted va a tener 0.8. Reflexiones finales. El actual arreglo macroeconómico no es consistente con el proceso de transformación económica emprendido. Para transparentar ese entorno hay que concluir el proceso de unificación monetaria y cambiaria, y ni siquiera se ha empezado. La actualización no ha sido capaz de producir el nivel de crecimiento económico que se necesita para colocar a Cuba en la senda del desarrollo. 7 años, 2011-2017, es un plazo más que razonable para juzgar si una estrategia económica se encuentra encarrilada o si no lo está. La valoración de las perspectivas de desarrollo nacional no pueden basarse en el examen de una visión construida principalmente sobre aspiraciones. Y por último, los cambios en el ritmo o alcance que necesita la reforma económica en el corto plazo no son visibles o no están claros para el grupo mayoritario de la población. Muchas gracias.
Tenemos 6 minutos para preguntas.
Mi pregunta es sobre el turismo de los Estados Unidos. A mi entender, el problema grande que hay es el problema del transporte de los turistas. Porque los turistas ahora no pueden ser transportados por firmas que controle el gobierno. ¿Cómo se va a resolver el problema del transporte de los turistas?
Bueno, ese es un gran problema. Ahora, no todo el transporte es militar. O sea, no todo el mundo se mueve por gaviota. O sea, hay otras empresas que también lo transportan, pero no tienen autobuses. Tuve una reunión el lunes sobre cruceros que van a Cuba. Y un dueño de crucero decía, yo llego a Dominicana y en 20 minutos un turista mío baja y está en la calle. En Cuba se demoran 45 minutos. Y la guagua se demora entre 20 y 30 minutos en recogerlo. Cuando yo estoy 6 horas en Cuba, 1 hora vale. Se demoran demasiado en salir un cubano, un turista de un crucero y estar en tierra y después moverse, porque hay problemas de transportación. Cuando van a alquilar un coche, le dicen, pero usted no lo contrató por agencia. No, yo quería un coche aquí. Dice, no, aquí abajo no hay coche. Los coches están para las personas que reservaron. Pero ¿cómo tú sabes si querías coger un coche o no? Entonces, es un problema grave. Y no solo del transporte, sino la infraestructura entonces. Las calles tienen muy mala situación, las calles tienen muy mala señalización. Entonces son problemas que están afectando. No obstante, los turistas norteamericanos se mueven en 2 kilómetros cuadrados. No se mueven mucho. Porque quieren ver La Habana Vieja, ese pedazo de ahí, quieren montarse en los almendrones, se mueven ahí. El problema son el otro grupo de turistas que quieren ir a Viñales un día, quieren ir a Trinidad un día, quieren ir a Santa Clara otro día. Ahí es donde se complica. Es una debilidad muy grande y hay muchos vehículos que están parados por una cosa tan absurda que una batería. Te va a alquilar un coche, ves 20 coches y te dice, no, no hay coche. Le digo, ¿y esos 20? Dice, no, esos no tienen batería. ¿Qué es esto? ¿Por qué? Porque una cosa es el transporte y otra es la empresa que le compra los equipos para el transporte. Hay una centralización de las decisiones. Una compañía tiene automóviles, pero no está autorizada a comprar las piezas repuestos para esos automóviles, porque eso viene por otra vía. Es lo que yo estoy diciendo, una descentralización de las decisiones.
Amarillo. Omar, muchas gracias por esta presentación. Una pregunta. La situación en Venezuela se está llegando a un punto crítico y ya no es descabellado pensar que puede haber un cambio de gobierno o algún cambio de situación política drástica. ¿Cuál es tu previsión? O sea, en este escenario hipotético, si de pronto el gobierno de Maduro cae o es sustituido por un gobierno de transición, ¿qué impacto concreto tendría en Cuba de modo inmediato?
Ya, la respuesta está. Un gran impacto. Va a haber un gran impacto porque has concentrado mucho el comercio con un solo país en cuanto al tema de los combustibles. La mayor parte del combustible que Cuba necesita, que es la mitad de antes, el 50%, proviene de Venezuela. Y se pagaba, pero con médicos. Otros países te pueden dar el mismo precio, pero es con efectivo. Como dijo Putin, yo estoy dispuesto a mandarle a Cuba todo el petróleo que necesita, mientras Cuba busque los mecanismos financieros adecuados. Es decir, busca tú el dinero. Entonces, eso ya se viene viendo. Sin embargo, todavía, a nivel de población residencial, no hay afectaciones de combustible en estos momentos. Hasta hace 2 días. Los recortes están viendo hacia el sector empresarial, junto con las importaciones, lo cual te va a indicar que en el segundo semestre las tasas de crecimiento no van a ser las esperadas. O sea,
Una pregunta más, la última en azul, el señor en azul.
Bueno, yo creo que voy a dar una respuesta a que yo preguntaba y qué pasaba en Cuba cuando el gobierno iba a hacer algo. Y es que Cuba no ha estado dirigiendo la dictadura, ha estado dirigiendo los años, llevan 65 años tomando medidas y van a hacer. Y el punto ahora es y es cierto la ¿tú consideras que con la infraestructura y la calidad de los servicios que se brindan en el país, a todos los niveles técnicos particulares, es que dominicamos dentro de 2 o 3 años sigan manteniendo el sistema?
no, por ahora sigue aumentando incremento, pero tú decías ya la respuesta. En la medida en que Cuba no logre un sistema de calidad competitivo con otras economías de la región, aquel que va la primera vez no va a repetir. Pero todavía hay mucha gente que quieren ir por primera vez. Pero esa curva va a llegar a un momento que puede ser 2, 3, 4 años. Ya La Habana Vieja, que hacía 2 años había tenido una calidad media, ahora se está afectando un poco la calidad porque ha habido cambio de gobierno en La Habana Vieja. Realmente Abaguaner pasó al grupo empresarial de la FARC y ha habido ya sus pequeñas dificultades. Yo te diría que hay que trabajar fuertemente en la calidad y ver el turismo de forma general. Estás hablándome de 2 calles en La Habana Vieja muy bonitas, pero cuando caminas a la tercera calle te encuentras el tercer mundo, de verdad. Entonces, o se trabaja de forma conjunta por todas las instituciones que tienen que ver si quieres lograr aumentar turistas durante un periodo largo de tiempo a unas tasas de crecimiento de 2 dígitos como lo que hay ahora, o sabrás que en algún momento ese interés, esa cosa de lo novedoso, empieza a perder importancia y va a caer. De todas maneras, la mayor parte del turismo que va a Cuba no es el norteamericano. O sea, todavía hay 1,5 millones de personas que tienen hielo, tienen nieve, y van entre enero, febrero y marzo. O sea, que hay un turismo canadiense que es importante, que ni pasa por Cuba. Ellos van en sus aviones a Los Cayos, de Los Cayos viran de nuevo. Entonces, ese es un grupo importante de turistas. Pero el turista que va más aislado, que gasta más que aquel viene con todo incluido, que con $700 va a Cuba y se pasa una semana, que no es el que se debería lograr en Cuba, ese turista, si no trabaja en la calidad, puede afectarse.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Vamos a la próxima presentación. La tercera presentación es por Jorge Pérez López. Jorge Perez Lopez is an international economist. He worked for 3 decades in the Bureau of International Labor Affairs of the U.S. Department of Labor. Since his retirement, he has been a consultant and advisor on labor standards in international supply chains. He is a long-term student of the Cuban economy and has written in the areas of economic growth, national accounts, environment, labor standards, foreign investment, and the external sector. Jorge?
Well, I'm delighted to be here today at the ASCII conference and honored to be on a panel with Carmelo and Omar, both friends and colleagues for many years that we have used different means to work together. The paper that I'm presenting today it has a little bit of overlap with some of the points that Omar made, but I'll try to go over them as quickly as possible. My paper is very ambitious. It tried to look at the Cuban external sector, which is obviously a huge undertaking. So I will try to just hit a few points and then end with a few questions, sort of potential shocks that might come to Cuba. I don't have a crystal ball, so I'll leave it up to you to decide what the impact of some of those external shocks might be. Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Sorry, I'm showing my ineptness in the technology area. The paper really is, talks mostly about external sector performance. This is a bit of a, it's a bit complicated because the statistical sources that are available from Cuba, and I try to use only Cuban data, are very sparse, and moreover, they're very dated in certain key areas. I'll mention this later on, but for example, on external debt, the latest data, I mean, it's very sparse what they have in the yearbook, but the latest year for which they have data is 2013. So if you look at the Cuban data, you sort of miss where all the action is, the renegotiations that happened in 2016, all of the things that are happening, Cuba's efforts to get more into the credit markets, you miss all that because it's not recorded there at all. So I'll try to run through a little bit of the balance of payments structure on what is available in Cuba, what is the latest that one can get from that. Some of the puzzles and mysteries about what some of this data might mean. Some of the data are just contradictory to what one would think. And then in the second part of the paper, I'll just mention briefly what might be some of these external shocks that are coming, which sort of is the rationale for my title of my paper, which is Cuba's never-ending crisis. There's a crisis ongoing that was in 2016. It was supposed to be over in 2017. It looks like it's still there in 2017, and there are a few things out there. I mentioned Venezuela, Brazil, and the U.S. That don't augur very well for improvements, but we'll get to that in a minute. You know, it's ironic that despite the importance of external sector to Cuba, and Cuba is an island country, it's a small country, it has a very limited natural resource base. It makes sense that it would be a trading country. It always has been a very open economy. And for a certain period of time, Cuban statistics were actually best with respect to trade and the informal sector. And if you look at the old handbooks, and I'm looking at Carmelo because we spent a lot of time looking at this handbooks together, that was sort of the meatiest part of the yearbooks, and they had the most detailed data. And that's sort of gone by the wayside. It's now 22 pages, I believe, of the entire handbook, and it's very sparse. the main technique, the main framework for looking at the external sector of the country is something called the balance of payments. It's an invention, I believe, of the IMF in the 30s or 40s. The last time that Cuba published what one would call full balance of payments, although at a very aggregate level, was 2001. So since 2001, there's no information on the Cuban balance of payments. What they have been showing in the handbook with a considerable delay is half, if you would, of the balance of payments, something that is called a current account, which is really important, but certainly not the only part of the balance of payments that is relevant. The handbook that is, I think they've started to publish some of the parts, the components of the statistical yearbook for 2016. There are a few that are up now, but external sector and national accounts, which are the ones that are probably of most interest to economists, are the ones that always come in at the very end, and that probably won't be until sometime towards the end of this year or early 2018. I'm looking at Mark Frank, who follows this like a hawk and knows when anything comes up and immediately publishes something in the Financial Times. So I think probably be the end of this year or early next year that we would have data for 2016, even on trade, which is awful. Here is the Cuban balance of payments. As I said earlier, this is not the full balance of payments, this is just the current account. These are all Cuban data, they are in pesos. I'm not making anything up. This is exactly what's published in the handbook. And a couple of observations that I would make based on this. I mean, the numbers themselves are not that important. The important are the tendencies and the balances. First of all, that the current account is positive. That is a very important element. And Cuba has had a positive current account now for some time. If you look at the two main components, which are merchandise trade and then services trade, you see, and Omar already alluded to this, the merchandise trade, which is net of exports minus imports, shows that Cuba has had a huge deficit in the current account, in the merchandise trade account. Cuba has, then the last time Cuba had a surplus on merchandise trade was 1960, and it was just an odd thing that the price of sugar was high and it was almost nothing. So Cuba usually has a negative balance of trade. What's amazing here is the balance of services trade, which you can see is humongous. $9 billion in 2010 to almost 13 or 12 plus in 2013. We'll come to that in a minute because that's mostly because of the services exports that has been the savior of the Cuban economy for a number of years. Let me just make a couple of other observations on this table. Well, let me move to more quickly here. Here's exports and imports. Omar already alluded to some of this. You can see the exports are in blue. The imports are in red, and you can see that there's a considerable gap in between those two, which is the merchandise trade deficit, and that it has been, it was growing through 2013. It's sort of declined. But cutting imports is not a real good idea because imports are required for food, first, for one thing, and oil and so on, but also because some of those imports are raw materials that are then used for the manufacturing sector or for export. So they are so interlinked that you have to be very careful that you don't wind up reducing imports and then wind up doing a damage to your capacity to export as well. Some of the things that have been happening in the trade behind these numbers, Cuba continues to import about 15% of total imports are food. Now, some of these food items indeed are grains and things of that nature that probably are not, cannot be grown in Cuba in commercial quantities, but a lot of it is beans, and a lot of it is corn, and a lot of it is coffee, and a lot of things are things that could be easily grown domestically. Omar alluded to some of the problems with the centralization of Acopio. The newspapers are full of the problems with boxes and containers and the mangoes that get wasted in the field because they're produced, but you can't get them to the market or to the place where they need to go. So this is a real big problem. Obviously, another important part of the imports are fuels, and Cuba has reduced the dependence on oil imports because has increased domestic production, mostly by share it, and it has a bit of natural gas and so on that is also used for electricity, but nevertheless, it's an important thing. The statistics that Cuba has for fuel, first of all, are not current. Second, as Jorge Piñon said, I think last year when he came, they're very difficult to interpret because some of the oil that Cuba imports from Venezuela actually is not for domestic consumption, is really for reprocessing and re-export. So it gets really tricky to figure all that out, and I don't know that anybody really has a complete handle on that. I didn't put all these tables up because it's too much, but Omar again alluded to this. Cuba continues to have a concentration on a few trading partners. Venezuela is number one on both exports and imports. China has grown as an import source. You have on the export side, because of nickel, Canada is an important source for Cuban exports, and so is the Netherlands, which is not obvious why, but it's because of the Rotterdam minerals metal market, which is located there, but still a very heavy concentration on exports. The thing that is sort of new and I think I'm trying to remember the numbers here. I think there are 14 or 15 tables on commodity exports from Cuba, and there's really none to speak of, or only one on services. Which is kind of interesting because services now are so much more important than commodities in terms of trade, yet the coverage in the handbook is really horrible. You can see these are the numbers again from Cuba. Here, I put at the bottom income from international tourism. International tourism under the BOP methodology is considered to be an export. These are gross export, gross income from tourism, so they're probably a little bit high because they need to be netted out for travel and so on. But nevertheless, it shows that at best, imports could account for maybe 22% of services exports, which sort of just reinforces the point that this is mostly professional Cuban personnel working abroad, and moreover, that means mostly medical doctors. There's some coaches and some other kinds of workers, and the main two sources for those are Venezuela and Brazil. So that's a market that is pretty concentrated on those two countries. Let me return back to this table, which I showed you before. I don't want to belabor this point, but there's some very strange things that are happening here. Transfers in the BOP methodology is supposed to be unrequited transfer, donations, gifts, foreign aid, all those kinds of things. But it's supposed to also include remittances. And one would think that the remittances account for Cuba would be quite positive, because although the numbers are not precise, it is well known that remittances are very high. Yet, the statistics don't show that at all. This is one of many puzzles on the Cuban BOP statistics, which it'll be for somebody else to figure out what they are. It's very, very tricky. There are no statistics at all on the capital and financial accounts, which is sort of the other part of the balance of payments that shows flows of income into the island. The main issues, the main factors here would be debt, because loans are considered part of the financial accounts, of course, and also investment. As I mentioned earlier, the data that are available in the handbook, which are only for 2013 on that, miss the whole exercise that Cuba went through in 2016 when they renegotiated some debt with the Paris Club. And I think this is a significant accomplishment for Cuba. They have been having this arrears for years. There was an issue there because Russia is now part of the Paris Club, and there was a debt from Russia that was involved, and there was the issue of the debt was incurred in rubles. What is the exchange rate for the ruble? Anyway, there was a whole brouhaha about how much the debt was, and they were able to set a level of debt which was good for Cuba, and they were able to renegotiate about $11 billion worth of non-performing debt. The downside of getting that resolved is that Cuba now has entered into, in some cases, this is the second or the third renegotiation of some of these monies, some pretty stiff terms that they're going to have to pay. So there's a seriousness to this debt that was not there before, and this is sort of the downside of the debt. On investment, I think Omar already talked about this a little bit. You have a very large effort to get a foreign investment to come in under two instruments, the Mariel Special Development Zone and also just the new foreign investment law. The amount of investment that is needed, foreign investment that is needed, according to Malmirka and everybody else, is $2 to $2.5 billion a year. Omar spoke about the portfolio. Here is the latest one. He says there's a new one in the making. This again is a nice brochure. It's very glossy. It's got a lot of icons. It's really quite attractive when you read this thing. But the last one shows 395 projects that were available for investment, 24 in Mariel and 371 elsewhere. What's actually happened? Well, there's not a lot of data available on this, but the person who runs the SED Mariel has said that through mid-March, about $1 billion had settled in SED Mariel, 996 million. By my count, there are 25 enterprises. Omar said 24, close enough. It's a number of them, but it's not a huge number. Most of them are still being, the buildings are being put up. There's not a lot of activity going on yet. The only two investments for which monies have been given, the amount, is the Brascuba, which is actually removing of a factory that was elsewhere in the country to SED Mariel, and then Unilever Suchel. Again, this is an all investment that ran into trouble, and it's being remade. So, but those are 35 and 160. Malmirka stated in 2016 that the total number of projects that had been accepted and the amount of investment under Law 118 was 83 for 1.3 billion. The law had been around for 2 years, so that works out to about $700 million a year. Compare that with the 2.5 million they need. I mean, it helps, but it's not tremendously successful. So where are things now, and where are things going? Cuba has suffered some fairly large balance of payments or foreign exchange crisis in the last few years. Of course, there's a special period, which I won't go into now. Everybody knows about that. There was a serious crisis in 2008, 2009, when there was a liquidity squeeze, and they actually confiscated froze the accounts of foreign businesses, and that was a very serious problem. There was a crisis starting in 2016, and if you read the latest on what's going on now in first quarter of 2017 by Cabrizas, you see that the crisis continues and could even deepen. The three areas, and I'll close with these three very quick points. The areas where I think there's vulnerability to Cuban development upcoming from the external sector are, of course, Venezuela. Don't have to spend a lot of time on that. There's been several studies by Ernesto, by several other economists on what might be the impact on the Cuban economy if the situation in Venezuela worsens, and if those oil flows were to stop or to be reduced. Omar answered the question, what would be the impact? And he said big. I think that captures it. It would be a huge impact. Cabrizas said that Cuba had to buy. He said that imports from Venezuela were 13% lower in the first half of 2017, and that they had to actually spend cash because the Venezuela oil comes under barter, all kinds of different arrangements, that they had to spend almost $100 million, which I assume it's from Russia. So this is, you can buy oil elsewhere, but you have to pay cash for it. Brazil, I don't know what to say. Brazil was emerging as a potential economic partner for Cuba. There was a bit of trade, there was some investment and so on. It's hard to tell how much of that was commercial and how much of it was political. With the decline of power of the Workers' Party in Brazil, Dilma's impeachment, and now it appears that Lula is convicted of fraud. I think Cuba's friends in Brazil are on the decline right now. There's some interesting stuff going on about this Odebrecht thing and the car wash Lavajato, the corruption investigation on Odebrecht. There's a report, couple of reports out there that actually the construction of the Mariel port was suggested to Odebrecht by Chavez, who then went to Lula to get financing, and they got the Social Development Bank of Brazil to pay for that. Now those accounts are being looked at, and there are questions whether the bank is going to continue to put up money for Odebrecht. So I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work out, but certainly the possibility of Brazil as being an important trading partner for Cuba and a positive force is in doubt. And I'll end with the U.S., and if anybody knows what that means or what's going to happen, That's great. I don't have any idea. I mean, what's pretty clear is that the speech that Trump gave here in June, I think, in Miami, when he talked about the cancellation of Obama's one-sided policy towards Cuba, it's, you know, it was just, it was illusory in what he said. There was really, when the changes that he suggested don't make one reach that conclusion. Having said that, regs have not been issued yet, and the devil is in the details, and it may be that there are some changes there. I think that the most immediate impact of this is of course, tourism. Obama had made more flexible some of the rules on tourism, on travel by Americans, and it looks like that's being tightened right now, and it will be tightened in the future. There's also this new thing about, you know, trying not to have any transactions with entities of the armed forces. You know, that remains to be seen how that will work. At one level, other than Gaviota, there wasn't a lot, because to my knowledge, there were no real investments that were made at that point, but it may be, but that may be something that happens in the future. I mean, all of the shocks that I mentioned here are potential negative shocks. None of them that I could see are positive. I think, you know, my conclusion is that in the last decades, Cuba's policy choices have sort of isolated the island from the international community and closed it off from international credit markets. There's no support from international financial institutions. They're all sort of things of its own doing that have increased vulnerability to external sector crisis. And I think there are some dark clouds looming. I mentioned Venezuela, Brazil, and the US that are potentially problematic for Cuba. But we've seen this thing before, and they seem to pull the rabbit out of the hat more than once, so I don't know exactly who is going to be the next savior of the Cuban economy. And that last sentence that I have in that email, in that note, it's one of the longest sentences I've ever written, so I'll erase that quickly. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take one question for Jorge, and then we'll open it up for questions for anyone on the panel. Yes, you like this.
Jorge, as you pointed out, the Cuban economy depends upon a sugar daddy. You did point out all the ones who are departing and how Mr. Putin now with sanctions has to be cash and carry. But China is very rich. China has all the reason in the world to stick its elbow into the U.S. South. Have you, in your work, did you discover any expansion of Chinese assistance, Chinese aid, Chinese trade, which would have an effect when the Venezuelans become history?
Fair point. And I deal with it a little bit in the paper, but I didn't use it here. I mean, China obviously is a commercial force, and they have increased exports to Cuba significantly. I think I did mention that. Buses and I think railway equipment, all sorts of things. The problem is it's not clear. I mean, there's a lot of announcements. I mean, there was, for example, 5-6 years ago, maybe even longer, that the Chinese were going into a joint venture of a new nickel mine in San Felipe, in Camagüey province. This is supposed to be a greenfield mill to increase production capacity. Well, that just never happened. It sort of went away. I mean, China is still the largest importer of Cuban sugar. I think they buy 500,000 tons a year, something like that. And that is, but that's because the Chinese are very tough on their debtors, and they require that Cuba provide sugar to pay for some credits that had happened there in the past. So yes, Paul, I think you're right, that China could be an important trading partner and, investment partner for Cuba. But, Chinese are pretty tough commercial operators. And, I think that they have terms that are a lot tougher, like Venezuela and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think you're right. China is a possibility, and it's hard to get a lot of information on that. But you can look at China in Latin America. Usually, the investments that they've gone into is raw materials, and they seem to be getting into food now. As I read the press, they are beginning to get into some agricultural issues. So I don't know how that might work out, but that is a possibility. Thanks for bringing that up.
Sylvia?
I just wanted to expand, thank you. I just wanted to expand a little bit on the point about the impact of Venezuela's decline in Cuba, which, as Omar said, is humongous. And I think that already you're beginning to see apagones once again, the electricity not being there for some time. And if the decline, I think, would also affect very much transportation, the food, and therefore the food sector. So I wonder if what we're going to see is not a second periodo especial, special period.
Well, maybe I'll start the conversation and others can join in, because I think your question is broader. In 2016, when there was a shortage of oil imports, actually there were very interesting statements by Cuban officials saying this is not a new special period. This is temporary. It's because PDVSA is having some technical problems in production and so on, and we want to assure everybody that there's no more special period. The growth in 2016 was minus 0.9%, right? Almost 1% decline. So, I think the government is trying really hard not to give the impression that there is a new special period, because it has some obviously bad connotations for the population. But it does look like oil imports are down again. In 2016, they were able to turn to Mr. Putin, and he came through with oil. But this again is a cash issue. The terms for Soviet oil, as I understand it, is really cash. So it's problematic. So I think it's possible that there may be another special period, but I think it's much too early to do that. And the first half of 2017 was better, 1.1%. It's better than negative 0.9, obviously. It's still not a tremendously strong performance. So it's kind of interesting. I think Cabrisa says they expect 1% for the year as a whole. So, I don't know exactly what they're talking about. And if you guys want to talk about that too.
The panel.
I'm sorry.
The panel's open to all panelists. El panel está abierto a todos los panelistas. Pero Loli, Juan, Sergio, y Mario. Okay, go ahead.
It's good that it's open, because my question goes to both, to all of you, really, and it goes back to remittance, okay? As you say, Jorge, the amount that in the balance of payment that is at that it's attributed to tourism is way over. When we used to have the actual numbers, you could see that it was a different series, which is, that went into the balance of payment. I'm not sure what that all includes. I think it includes the $400 I spend on my passport, and things like that also. But my question goes, is it possible that remittance are included in the export, or can we backtrack, and do we have a good estimates of professional services so that makes up the difference? Am I making?
It would be highly unusual to have remittances be anywhere else but transfers. They could be put someplace else, but I don't I don't see, I guess I don't quite understand your question.
Can the difference between tourism and in service exports reasonably be attributed to, professional services abroad, which is the other big categories? There's nothing else.
Yeah.
And I guess it's more for Everleni.
No, nada. Eso es lo que le quería responder a Silvia. ¿Puedo? Ya.
Ok. Bueno, vamos a seguir. Omar quiere hablar
Sí.
a Silvia.
Sí, yo creo que, Silvia, volver a los apagones en Cuba es políticamente muy riesgoso. Acuérdate que en la época de los apagones no habían turistas en La Habana. O apagas La Habana con tantos turistas adentro y pierdes los turistas, que es la única fuente de ingresos. O sea, ya es un problema entre económico, entre político y entre riesgo. Al principio todo el mundo pensaba que eso iba a durar poco, pero ya hay mucha gente que tiene experiencia de aquella época. Y no sé si ustedes saben que cada vez que se apagaba La Habana, el tamaño de las piedras que se tiraban eran más grandes de las posibles. Y eso realmente convirtió una situación inmanejable. Es decir, que lo último que se podría afectar en un nivel de decisiones es volver a apagar La Habana. También que los equipos que se rompieron por falta de mantenimiento saben que no volverán a hacer. Y realmente ha habido una inversión muy fuerte de varios miles de millones, que es lo que se está pagando ahora, en reparar aquellas antiguas termoeléctricas, las grandes, con créditos de la República Checa y con créditos de la de Rusia. Estoy todavía en aquella época, porque los equipos son de aquella época. Y yo creo que ya no es lo mismo, no es lo mismo. Yo creo que es una situación diferente totalmente y que el Estado no debería entrar en buscar tener una dificultad adicional de las que ya tiene. Es lo que...
¿Cuánto más será el próximo?
Jorge, hay un dato escondido en tu presentación que es muy interesante para lo que tú y Omar dicen. Cuando tú dices que Unilever, una inversión en el Mariel de 35 millones, Unilever es más grande que Procter & Gamble. Unilever es todo lo que tú necesitas para llenar un supermercado, desde el aceite de Bertolli hasta el jabón Dove. Y contra una inversión de 35 millones de dólares, no creo que puedan llenar más de 2 o 3 paladares. O sea, sí.
Sí, tiene razón, es pequeñísima la inversión. Creo que son jabones y algún tipo de champú, ¿no? O sea, quizás sean más bien basados al turismo y para tratar de suplir las cadenas de turismo. Es pequeñísimo, ¿sí?
Sí, lo que pasa es que la jugada de Unilever fue muy interesante. Unilever estuvo en Cuba una presencia muy grande. Y cuando en el 2004 se decidió empezar a cerrar todos aquellos negocios que habían vencido el periodo del cual se lo aprobó, Unilever salió. Unilever nunca quiso irse y el Estado la presionaba y él pedía una excepción de 1 año y estuvo ahí hasta que llegó un momento en que casi tuvo que irse. Apareció Mariel, hicieron una jugada para tratar de mantener el mercado cubano, que ya es conocido, porque Unilever tuvo 15 años en Cuba y realmente le demostró al Estado que después que ellos se fueron de la fábrica, la producción decayó a tal punto que no se ha podido recuperar solamente a base de importaciones. Y se ha traído detergentes de China, detergentes de Vietnam, por no dejar a Unilever producir el detergente que producía en Cuba. Entonces ahí ellos lograron esa jugada de seguir manteniendo la presencia en Cuba. Entonces presentaron un pequeño proyecto de 35 millones, pero yo estoy seguro que van a hacer una reinversión después que termine la primera. De hecho, el representante nunca se fue. Desde ellos estaban buscando una oportunidad de volver a quedarse.
Sergio, ¿tenías preguntas?
I have a question. We talk a lot about Venezuela North, and Muni's not here. But a few years ago, there was talk that they were bringing a rig from China, pulling across the Pacific and so forth. So what's happening with all the potential plans for exploration in the sea, given that the petroleum situation looks so poor? Of course, at $50 a barrel, it might not make sense to spend a lot of money. So do we know anything of what's going on there?
Well, I think the last point you made is very important. I mean, with the price of oil very low, making these investments, oftentimes it doesn't make sense from an economic perspective. I think that the large drilling platform that was in Cuba had other commitments in Brazil and elsewhere, and that's why it went. There was supposed to be sort of other exploration by the Russian company in oil that is not as far out in the middle of the ocean. But I don't know if those are happening and whether they've been successful. Certainly the press has not really spoken about that. So I think that's still there. I think what it seems is that the oil in that area exists, but it's going to be difficult to extract and costly. So with the current oil prices, I think it's just not economically feasible to do that. But maybe somebody else knows more about this than I do. Carmelo Panetta.
All exploration in high seas didn't find financially potential wells. There was one, but it was not commercial. And therefore, they have moved more to close to the shore, but very little information is available on that.
We have time for two last
Can I make a
questions.
comment about the Russian supply of 250,000 tons to Cuba? Okay, this is a lot, because when you transfer that to barrels, it's more than 1 million barrels. But the Minister of Energy in Russia said that this is not charity, and that if Cuba wants more oil, they have to pay for it. And one comment about China. China have the largest deficit outside of Venezuela. We are talking about $2 billion in 2015. We don't have the data for 16 yet. And I think it's extremely difficult under that situation that China provides more export to Cuba if there is not pay in cash or by imports from Cuba, and then basically what they can do is to send sugar that they are fulfilling the quota every year.
We have time for two last questions. Mario has had his hand up for a while, and Domingo?
Primero quiero felicitar a los representantes, a Carmelo, a Jorge, a Omar, por tratar de descifrar esa incógnita que es la economía cubana. Pero tengo una pregunta tal vez para los tres, aunque comienzo con Omar. En tu ponencia, si entendí bien, dice que hace falta una tasa de crecimiento del Producto Interno Bruto Real entre el 5 y el 6,5% para llegar a un desarrollo, ¿no? ¿Cómo se define eso en la economía cubana? Entonces ahí van mis preguntas, ¿no? Porque partiendo del 1% más o menos que estamos ahora, tengo tres preguntas. La primera, ¿cuáles medidas serían necesarias para llegar ahí, ¿no? Y en realidad si es factible llegar al 5, al 6% con la tasa de inversión que tiene Cuba, con la infraestructura, con todo. La segunda pregunta es si existe alguna voluntad política para implementar esas medidas, no solamente ahora, sino en lo que se oye, ¿no? Es decir, con lo que viene en el año 18. Y finalmente, quizás Carmelo me responda a esta, si puede, el impacto social de esas medidas, ¿cuáles serían y cuáles otras medidas serían necesarias para contrarrestar ese impacto social? Así que, muchas gracias.
Bueno, todas las cuentas esas que me pregunta ya están realizadas. Es decir, ese fue un documento que el gobierno le pidió al centro que yo dirigía en aquellos momentos. Y nosotros llegamos a la conclusión que para que Cuba crezca a entre el 5 y el 7%, que es lo que se necesita para realmente acortar el periodo de, o sea, el nivel de vida de la población y acercarnos a aquellos procesos que lo han hecho rápidamente, como China, Vietnam, que han crecido sistemáticamente después del 5% durante 20 o 30 años. Cuba necesitaba aumentar la inversión, es ponernos a una tasa promedio de alrededor de un 25% del nivel de inversión. Ahora, para llegar a ese nivel de inversión significa que el país tiene, con el ahorro interno, una insuficiencia muy grande de recursos. La única vía posible para complementar lo que hacía falta era recibir 2.500 millones de dólares por inversión extranjera anualmente. Nada de eso se ha cumplido. O sea, los documentos están y demuestran a dónde hay que llegar, pero la voluntad es la siguiente: si sigues haciendo lo mismo, no podrás lograr resultados diferentes. Es muy sencillo. Son aspiraciones, quieren llegar, pero si no cambias desde abajo la base y la forma de administrar la economía y sigues dándole discurso a un trabajador agrícola para que produzca más caña, eso es el método que se utilizaba en los años 60. Siguen las mismas personas utilizando los mismos métodos de trabajo. Entonces son aspiraciones.
Última pregunta. Aquí adelante.
¿Puedo contestarle la pregunta?
Perdón.
Sí, sí. Sobre el tema social, es extremadamente difícil porque el gobierno ha estado diciendo, y yo estoy de acuerdo con eso, que para aumentar el salario, para aumentar las pensiones, que tiene que haber un incremento del Producto Interno Bruto y de la productividad. Pero, es decir, no hemos visto eso. Lo que ha habido una caída de 0,9 en 16, bueno, este año quizás un 1%. Yo creo que el segundo semestre va a ser mucho peor que el primer semestre. Me parece que un 1% es optimista, pero veremos a ver qué pasa. Entonces, es muy difícil. ¿Cómo pueden aumentar los salarios? La única forma de aumentar los salarios es aumentar la producción. Y eso no está ocurriendo. Es extremadamente difícil. Y eso es un problema explosivo, especialmente el tema del envejecimiento, las pensiones, la atención de la salud, todo eso es está en situación de crisis a mediano plazo.
Gracias. La última pregunta.
Domingo.
Sí, me perdonan el uso de un par de cubanismos, pero es importante. La conclusión que se deriva es, como diría algún cubanito por allá, de que después de jodido no hay más pueblo. Eso por una parte. Por la otra, creo que los ponentes y los que escuchan deben también seguir el sabio consejo de las dos jabas. Siempre en la vida tenemos que andar con dos jabas. Y esto nos sugiere la idea de que hay que también contemplar otros escenarios. Que yo sepa, la vieja guardia no tiene vocación suicida. Además, la madre naturaleza ya se encarga de decirle adiós a esa vieja guardia. Quienes vienen, quienes están ahí, a doblar de la esquina, muy cerquita, es una generación llamada intermedia, completamente diferente, más cercana al estado mental de Everleni que cualquier otra cosa relacionada con el pasado. Y en los contextos internacionales, para la segunda java, yo creo que también hay que contemplar otros escenarios no tan melodramáticos, y digo, en este caso, que el gobierno de Maduro, de los chavistas, como se le quiera llamar, pueda salir de la crisis en la que está con su constituyente y demás medidas, y una ayudita de los precios del petróleo que pueden estar subiendo un poco. Creo que Lula puede sortear la acusación y ser el nuevo presidente de Brasil el año que viene, según indican todos los estudios y todas las encuestas. Tendremos buenas noticias en México con López Obrador de presidente.
La pregunta, por favor, la pregunta, porque ya tenemos poco tiempo.
Creo que son ideas que hay que contemplar también.
Bueno, Domingo, creo que tú has ciertamente puesto sobre la mesa una serie de alternativas interesantes. Nos reuniremos otra vez el año que viene, pienso yo, y a lo mejor ya sabremos si Lula fue reivindicado y está de nuevo en la presidencia, y si el presidente Maduro continúa si PDVSA ha aumentado las exportaciones de petróleo, o sea que todo eso lo veremos, pero creo que es importante el punto que tú has sacado a colación, y es que hay muchas incógnitas y que puede haber otras alternativas.
A mí me parece que de todo lo que tú dices, lo más factible es lo de México. Y México tiene petróleo, pero hay que ver qué pasa.
Mira, yo me resisto a seguir pensando en las variables externas. Yo creo que las variables externas, si vienen, son importantes. Yo creo que el tamaño de Cuba no da para cambiar ninguna variable externa, ni puede influir en Brasil ni en Venezuela, aunque se diga que estamos allí, ni puede influir en México. Si vienen, bienvenido sea. Yo creo que el esfuerzo debe ser de lo que tú puedes ser capaz de controlar, que es la economía interna, que todavía tiene un espacio y un alcance que puedes lograr con las fuerzas internas, descentralizando, copiando experiencia de otros países, no el modelo, como el caso de Vietnam, etcétera, etcétera, y podríamos avanzar mucho más. Si después nos ayuda el factor externo, precios del azúcar mejores, todo bienvenido, pero siempre hemos estado pensando del externo, y en los discursos de nuestros dirigentes siguen hablando lo externo primero. No, concéntrate en lo interno, no me dejes el último párrafo para lo interno, que es lo que tú puedes hacer porque es lo que tú controlas.
Muchas gracias. Hemos concluido la sesión, gracias a los panelistas, y a las 11 empezamos otra vez.